So I just wanted to mention very briefly few of the achievements that Nicaragua achieved under the Sandinista leadership, whether it is poverty reduction from 48.3% to 24.9%. Healthcare in Nicaragua is a human right. It is free for all Nicaraguan. Life expectancy at birth increased from 72 years in 2010 to 74 years in 2020. The rate of birth attended by skilled health staff increased from 67% in 2000 to 96% in 2020. Mortality rate for under 5 and so on. I can go on and on. The achievements are incredible. Enrollment in secondary school went from 37% in 2000 to 53% in 2010 to 73% in 2020. Children receive free lunch at school, and in poor areas, 2 meals a day. And we should also mention that Nicaragua ranked 6th in the Global Gender Gap Index and 5th in 2020. For comparison, the United States is ranked 30. So we were very impressed with what we saw, and we are very excited that today we have Camila Escalante and Ben Norton with us to talk about Nicaragua. Camila Escalante is a TV news producer and presenter at teleSUR, and she also worked with Kawsachun News in Bolivia. Ben Norton from Managua, Nicaragua, is a journalist, writer, filmmaker, and assistant editor of the Grayzone. Please, everybody, feel free during the conversation to put your question in the chat, and Ben and Camila will address it. So I think we should start with what happened in Nicaragua in 2018, because we do not know much about it, and because these events are central to this multidimensional, vicious campaign to overthrow the Sandinista government and destroy the Nicaraguan revolution. It is important to see the present US aggression toward Nicaragua as part of the ongoing, shifting, 5-decade-long failed US campaign to defeat the Sandinista and the Nicaraguan revolution. We, US taxpayer, has spent billions of dollars on this failed campaign. It is time to shift our priorities from global war, militarism, and aggression to invest in human needs. And now I'm done, and I'm delighted to give the floor to Ben and Camila. So thank you, Ben and Camila, for joining us, and thank you everybody else who is with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Camila, I guess, do you want to start, or rather, do you want me to start focusing on Nicaragua, and then you can talk about the coup in Bolivia? Because I think in order to understand the kind of new playbook, I can maybe spend 10 minutes talking about Nicaragua, you can spend 10 talking about Bolivia, and then we can move on to the elections.
Definitely, go ahead.
So thank you to everyone for this event. It's great to see you all. It's great to be back at this excellent group, and thanks for all the work that you do. I'm just going to spend a few minutes here talking about the 2018 coup attempt. And I think we have to understand this coup attempt in light of the rest of the region. That's why I think it'll be really excellent to hear Camila's analysis of the coup in Bolivia, because we have to keep in mind that the coup attempt in Nicaragua was not isolated. In 2017 in Venezuela, there was a very similar coup attempt using the same exact tactics. And then in 2019, the coup actually succeeded in Bolivia. And of course, we've seen many coups throughout Latin America going back well over 100 years. The famous 54 CIA coup in Guatemala against Arbenz, the famous 73 coup against Allende in Chile. But I think in some ways it's important to look back at those historical coups to see similarities. But there are also a lot of differences in these modern coups in the past few years. There's an entire new playbook. And in order to understand this new playbook, those 3 years are pivotal: 2017, 2018, and 2019. In each year, there was a coup attempt. Venezuela in 2017, Nicaragua in 2018, and Bolivia in 2019. Now, in Venezuela in 2017, we see so many similarities to the coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018. Specifically, there's the creation of a new tactic. It's not entirely new, but it's become kind of one of the main tools in the toolbox of the U.S. coup manual, and that is the creation of these violent barricades that these insurgents use in countries where the U.S. wants regime change, and then they erect these barricades and basically take over territory, seizing territory that the government and the security forces cannot control, and then using that territory to wreak havoc, to hunt down leftists, to deal drugs and get money, and then use that drug money to buy more materials and weapons. So in Venezuela in 2017, the barricades were called guarimbas. And there's a lot of videos you can find on YouTube. Abby Martin of the Empire Files did a really good documentary about the coup attempt in Venezuela in 2017. She actually is extremely brave. She and Mike Preisner went to the guarimbas. They went to some of the guarimbas in Venezuela, which was extremely dangerous, and they filmed it. In 2018 in Nicaragua, they used the exact same strategy. The only difference was the name. Instead of guarimbas, they used the name tranques. And across Nicaragua, there were tranques, not just in Managua. In fact, some of the most violent tranques were in Masaya, a major city that is about an hour south of the capital, Managua. There were also tranques in Jinotepe and other cities. And basically the way it works is that when the protests began, which I'll talk about in a second, in April, which were the inciting moment for the coup, after the protests and there was this instability, there were these violent armed elements that began waging a low-scale war against the state, against the police forces, against Sandinistas, and they began taking over neighborhoods and erecting these tranques. And what that did is it prevented certain roads from being used for months. So this didn't happen immediately when the protests began in April 2018, but several weeks after the protests began and it became more and more violent, they began taking over entire areas. They also occupied universities, and then they used those universities and the areas they controlled basically in the way that insurgents would in a kind of guerrilla war. This is obviously a lower level kind of insurgency. It's not the same level of a guerrilla war like the Contras did in the 1980s, but it's similar tactics in that you want to take over territory, occupy territory, control that territory, don't allow the state forces, the security forces to enter, and then just wreak havoc in there. So immediately when the protests began in April, what you have is you have this kind of dual strategy. And it's similar to what happened in Syria in 2011, where there are legitimate protests, but then there are violent extremist elements that are armed and that use those protests as a platform to militarize the situation. That's exactly what happened in Syria in 2011. It's also what happened in Libya in 2011, which of course is what NATO used as an excuse to invade, basically to do constant airstrikes and to destroy the state of Libya. Now Libya and Syria are extreme examples, but there's parallels we can see through all of these. And they began with these protests that had some legitimate elements and some illegitimate elements. And then very quickly, it becomes very confusing and the situation on the ground becomes chaotic and it militarizes. Now, this is also what happened in 2019 in Bolivia. And of course, we don't have all of the documents at this point showing the CIA involvement and all of that. I'm sure we're going to have that in the 10, 20 years to come. We're going to start getting a trickle of documents showing intelligence involvement, but we also don't even necessarily need those documents to understand where the funding came from these operations, who were behind these operations, because we already do have a lot of evidence to this point. I did an article I can share in the comments after I speak. I'll share a few articles that I wrote. One of them that looks at the funding of the coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018. And we can look at certain organizations, specifically the Chamorro Foundation. Now, the Chamorro Foundation in Nicaragua is one of the most important opposition groups. It is named after the Chamorro oligarchy. The Chamorros, since the country of Nicaragua, the modern state, was founded about 150 years ago, there have been 7 presidents from the Chamorro family. It's the most powerful oligarch family in the country. And the first president after the Sandinista, the first right-wing president after the Sandinista revolution, the Sandinista revolution triumphed in 1979, and then in 1990, through a CIA rigged election in which the CIA, through the National Endowment for Democracy, just poured money into the campaign and created the campaign of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who is a member of this oligarch family. They created her campaign. They created something called the UNO, the National Opposition Union. They funded media outlets through the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, specifically the main propaganda newspaper La Prensa, which is owned by the Chamorros. And of course, because of the U.S. economic blockade in Nicaragua and because of the terrorist war through the Contras, they made it basically impossible for the Sandinistas to win the 90 election. So the Sandinistas voluntarily left power. And from 1990 until 2007, the neoliberal right-wing forces were in power. So after Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, Violeta Chamorro was president, when she left her presidency, she created the Chamorro Foundation. And in the coup attempt in 2018, the Chamorro Foundation was one of the key institutions that was used to facilitate the transfer of money from the United States and also Europe to the coup leaders. We have so many documents proving this, from the U.S. Agency for International Development, from the National Endowment for Democracy, that is USAID and NED. These are key CIA cutouts. One of the co-founders of the NED, Alan Weinstein, admitted in an article and an interview in 1991 in the Washington Post with David Ignatius, the loyal CIA stenographer at the Washington Post. Alan Weinstein boasted, he said that what we do in the NED today is what the CIA did 25 years ago covertly. The difference is that we do it overtly. So we have so many documents, which I'll share the link of the investigations I've done, showing the funding going from the NED and USAID to the Chamorro Foundation, and then from the Chamorro Foundation to a coterie of so-called NGOs, which are created by the right-wing opposition leaders in Nicaragua. And these NGOs don't really do anything. All they do is they create the NGO, which gives them a legal pretext to receive funding from the US and also from Spain and other European Union member states. And we have the document showing many millions of dollars going to leading organizations of people like Felix Maridiaga, one of the coup leaders, of the Chamorros, who I mentioned, of Arturo Cruz, of Juan Sebastian Chamorro, who is one of the main, all from the Chamorro family, but one of the main right-wing, kind of Pinochet-style right-wing oligarchs. So anyway, there was this apparatus that was created, funded largely by U.S. intelligence cutouts, and the role of USAID is important because USAID in the 1980s was also used to send weapons on so-called humanitarian flights. This was admitted by Elliot Abrams, who came back in the Trump administration to oversee the Venezuela coup attempts. And Elliot Abrams in the 1980s would put weapons into so-called humanitarian flights to Nicaragua and later boasted about it in the New York Times. And in 2019, after the coup attempt failed in Nicaragua, in 2019, there was another coup attempt in Venezuela, but a different playbook, not as violent as 2017. This was with Juan Guaido. You probably remember in February, the US declared that Juan Guaido is the so-called interim president of Venezuela. And the US and Canada had been working with a series of countries, about 30 countries, to recognize Juan Guaido that week. Well, in that coup attempt in February 2019, after Juan Guaido self-declared fake interim president, in February, a month after he self-declared, on February 23rd, I was in Venezuela at the time, there was another coup operation on a bridge connecting Venezuela and Colombia. And the US, through USAID, tried to force through so-called humanitarian aid, which the United Nations condemned. The United Nations said this is not humanitarian aid because it's extremely political. This is politically motivated. It's not apolitical humanitarian aid. So actual humanitarian organizations condemn this, but USAID, along with the Defense Department and very likely US intelligence, we don't have the documents necessarily yet proving that the CIA was involved, but we have press releases from the Pentagon proving that USAID and the Pentagon were working together along with the State Department to try to force through these so-called aid convoys across the bridge into Venezuela. Now, Venezuela understood what was happening. This was yet another coup attempt, and refused to allow the so-called aid convoy to go through. And then what happened later is that the far-right coup elements backed by Colombia and by the US lit the aid convoy on fire and then blamed it falsely on the Venezuelan government, which we reported at the Grayzone. My colleague Max Blumenthal correctly reported at the time, showing video that it was actually the coup elements backed by the US, not the Venezuelan government, that lit the so-called aid convoy on fire. That was actually later admitted by the New York Times months after the coup failed. But anyway, the point is that in this coup attempt, USAID played an integral role, working hand in glove with the US military in trying to launch a military coup in February 2019 in Venezuela, along with the Colombian military and elements that had defected from the Venezuelan military and that were part of this operation. So this was not an aid operation. It was a violent military coup attempt. And this was admitted basically slightly indirectly, but it was admitted by USAID last year. In 2020, USAID published a report, or actually it might have been earlier this year. I have a report, I can post it in the comments. USAID admitted that the funding that it was using for this operation was going directly to Juan Guaido, that it was not a humanitarian aid effort. And USAID's own internal office of, like, their watchdog, their office of management, they admitted that funding was not used for actual humanitarian aid, but rather for this political operation, which they didn't call a coup, but it was a coup. Anyway, the reason I explain all of that because that's exactly what happened in Nicaragua, is that USAID used this idea that it was providing humanitarian assistance to fund the coup elements in 2018 in Nicaragua. So one other crucial element here before I pivot to Camila to talk about the 2019 coup in Bolivia, because there's so many similarities between all of these coup operations. That's why I'm kind of being loose describing the three Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia coup attempts, because it's the same playbook, and it's US intelligence and intelligence cutouts like the NED and USAID and their allies on the ground that are doing all this. So the other crucial element to understand about the coup attempt in Nicaragua is how fake news played a key role in this. And this goes back to the beginning of when the coup attempt began in April of 2018 here in Nicaragua. And there was fake news and media propaganda that played a key role in two ways. The first was that when the protests began, there was this narrative that was constructed that was entirely absurd to anyone that knew anything about Nicaraguan politics, but it was constructed to try to win over progressives. It was not targeting the right wing. You don't need to manufacture consent for the right wing. The right wing already wants a coup against Nicaragua. They already want a coup against Venezuela. Instead, this sophisticated fake news operation was targeting progressives and specifically the so-called Sandinistas. That's a term sometimes used for like the North Americans and the Europeans who came to Nicaragua in the 80s in solidarity with the revolution. And many of them turned against the Sandinistas when they came back to power in 2007. And we can talk about that later. But this propaganda operation was trying to portray the Sandinista government as implementing so-called neoliberal reforms, which is hilarious. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's blatant fake news. But what happened in April of 2018, at the beginning of the coup attempt, that the inciting moment was that the government announced that they were doing these reforms to the social security system, because this is a social security system that the Sandinistas inherited, the model they inherited from the neoliberals when they returned to power in 2007 through democratic elections. It was insolvent and it was going to go bankrupt. So they had to change the policies to make sure that the social security system did not go bankrupt. And in order to do that, the Sandinistas announced they were going to do a very slight increase on young people, not recipients of Social Security. People who already had Social Security would not have to pay any more, but younger people would have to pay 1% more, and corporations would have to pay 3% more. So it was 75% of the increase was on private companies, and 25% of the increase was on young people. Now, okay, you can criticize that policy, but the vast majority, the bulk of the increase was on the private sector, was on corporations. So in response to that announcement, which, by the way, that was not the announcement the IMF wanted. The IMF wanted a total neoliberal reform, which, of course, the Sandinista government refused to support. So they issued that reform, which puts the majority of the increase on private corporations. So in response to that, the COSEP, which is the Chamber of Commerce in Nicaragua, which is controlled by the right wing, obviously, it's a main source of corporate power of the oligarchy. It was COSEP, the Chamber of Commerce, that called for protests against the Nicaraguan government's reforms because they wanted the IMF reforms. COSEP explicitly said, we want the IMF reforms, which would not have increased taxes on corporations, but rather would have put the burden entirely on working people, which is explicitly neoliberal. The government's reforms were not neoliberal. So what happened is that in April of 2018, with the confusion there was this narrative created that the government is doing this unpopular reform, and students began to protest. And when the students began protesting, that is when the coup operation, which had clearly been planned for months or years in advance, with especially figures like Felix Maradiaga, got involved. Now, Felix Maradiaga is not a student. If you don't know who he is, Felix Maradiaga is one of the main coup leaders. He has a fake NGO that was funded by the US government. Felix Maradiaga has been cultivated by regime change networks going back a decade, specifically to the World Economic Forum. Felix Maradiaga is a rich businessman in Nicaragua and participated in numerous World Economic Forums, that is Davos conferences. And there's so many videos of him in the United States with the Harvard Kennedy School, where he studied alongside Juan Guaido and Carlos Vecchio, the main leaders of the coup attempt in Venezuela. He also studied in Chicago. So he's been cultivated for over a decade by these elite institutions, by the World Economic Forum. His wife, Berta Valle, is now one of the key, is the part of the core of the Nicaragua coup lobby in Miami. She moved to Miami after the coup attempt failed. And Berta Valle, like her husband, Felix Maradiaga, has also been cultivated by the World Economic Forum. So when the students start their protests, that is when the violent elements, the extremist elements, the drug-linked elements begin to make the situation very violent and to militarize the situation, like what happened in Syria. So in response to that, the Nicaraguan government understands what's happening because Ortega and the security forces have a history, of course, of fighting against the Contras. They have a history of facing with these violent elements. And Ortega made a very concerted decision. He decided to not allow the police, after a few weeks of these violent protests. I mean, you can't even really call them protests because there were some protests, but at the same time, there were a lot of violent attacks. And you can find videos of this, of people burning down government buildings, including what was called Radio Ya, which was a major Sandinista radio station. And there's video you can find on YouTube of these coup elements burning down the radio station. And then fake news in the media blamed that on the government, as if the Sandinista government, for some reason, is so crazy they would burn down their own Sandinista radio station. So anyway, there's these violent attacks that begin to emerge after the April protests. They start attacking Sandinistas. They burn down the houses of Sandinistas. They kill Sandinistas. And the government decides to put the police in their barracks and to not allow the police to go out of the barracks because they understood that the strategy being used is a strategy of insurgency being used in Hong Kong. And there was a Hong Kong leader an insurgency leader funded by the US government who wrote an article in the New York Times. And the headline of something to the effect of, the point is to get the police to hit you. You can look it up on the New York Times. The point is to get the police to hit you. And in the article, this US government funded Hong Kong insurgent admits to using the same exact tactics that the coup leaders in Nicaragua used in 2018. What he says is that you should be as aggressive as possible in your tactics up to the point of causing a civil war. You don't want a civil war, but you want to encourage as much violence as possible with these aggressive tactics against the police. And then you use the video of those police and you broadcast those video because there's constant journalist coverage, there's 24/7 streaming. And then you use that coverage to portray the response of the government to the violence that the insurgents initiated as a so-called authoritarian crackdown. And then you use that footage to say that the Chinese government is an authoritarian police state, or in the case of Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan regime supposedly is killing the protesters, when in reality, it's the Nicaraguan police that were responding to armed extremists who were trying to launch a coup. So in response to that, the government understood quickly what was happening. The government understood that there was a threat of this spiraling into a civil war. So Ortega ordered the police to stay in their barracks. And then that was the next stage of the coup, which by May and June got extremely violent to a whole new level, where there were basically these armed gangs that were putting sieges on the police barracks, and specifically in Masaya, the city of Masaya. I mentioned one of the major cities. They besieged the mayor's office of Masaya, and they tortured, and Camila can talk about this too. We met some of the victims of torture. They kidnapped the guards who were guarding the mayor's office in Masaya, who were not armed at that time because Nicaragua didn't have many guns before 2018, before it was flooded with guns by the US and other countries. And so the guards were kidnapped and tortured, and one of them was named Reynaldo Urbina. He was tortured so badly that his arm had to be amputated. And again, this is a mayor's office guard. So, and at that point, it became extremely violent. But the decision of the government was to let the coup attempt fizzle out, because if the state doesn't respond, eventually the coup attempt is going to fizzle out because they don't have the propaganda of the state responding, because that's exactly what happened in Hong Kong. The insurgents push it to a whole new level, and then the state responds, and then they use it as propaganda to say, look at this brutal authoritarian regime. And then that media footage it inspires more people to join the attempt. And this is a color revolution. This is what the US did in the former Soviet countries in the 1990s. It's what it tried to do in China multiple times. It's the playbook for a color revolution, where there's so much propaganda and people become so disenchanted that they eventually overthrow the government. So the Sandinista government decided to put the police back in their barracks. And what happened, and this leads to the whole propaganda about the so-called paramilitaries. Now, what that actually meant is that there were Sandinista groups that were defending their neighborhoods from the fascist death squads that were hunting down and killing them. And there's videos of the far-right extremist coup plotters of them marking houses of Sandinistas with paint. I mean, the stuff they do in the Bible, like saying that, like, these are the houses of Sandinistas. You should burn this house down. You should shoot this house in a drive-by. So Sandinistas begin to arm themselves and begin to defend their neighborhoods against these fascist elements. So eventually, finally, by the anniversary of the revolution on July 19th, the coup attempt started to fizzle out, and the communities became so angry, they turned against, even if they weren't Sandinistas, they turned against the coup elements, and they began to, in June and July, these communities began to go out and dismantle the tranques. The tranques are the coup barricades that were erected by the coup plotters, and community members who are not even Sandinistas necessarily, mothers, grandmothers, they would go out and say, we've had enough. We don't want any more violence in our communities. We're tired of this. You drug dealers, you're always drunk, you're on drugs, you're bringing violence and crime into our neighborhoods. We want you to leave. And organically, the community began to push back against the coup attempt. The coup elements lost support, the little support that they had within communities. The money fizzled out and the ammunition fizzled out. And by July, by the anniversary of the revolution, there was a massive march in support of the Sandinista revolution, and the coup attempt completely failed. And the police went out of their barracks, and they removed all of the rest of the tranques, and the country came back to to peace. So I know that was longer than I was supposed to say, but that really is the whole playbook for Nicaragua, for the coup attempt. And from the beginning to the end, from April until July, with all the different elements. And now Camila can talk about how there's so many similarities between that coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018 and exactly what happened a year and a half later in Bolivia in October and November of 2019.
Yeah, like you said,
Yes,
tons of.
and they
Did you
might
have some?
see you, but I can
Okay.
take off the audio for a hot second.
Oh. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Like Ben said, there's a lot of similarities between these cases, starting with the 2017 destabilization attempts in the Guarimbas in Venezuela, and then what I call the Nicaraguan Guarimbas in 2018 in April. And, we saw the continuation of that in Bolivia in 2019. So in 2019, we saw what was the fourth, what Evo says is the fourth coup attempt against him. And this is the first successful one. And so, beginning early on in the year, we saw different sectors of the right wing, including the Medical College of Bolivia, these kind of like right-wing doctors associations, carry out a series of strikes, threatening the government, saying they weren't going to provide medical care. They're just generally against, the accessibility of healthcare and want to keep healthcare private, and for profit. So that made a lot of international media headlines. Then we saw, later in the year, midway through 2019, we began to see the environment becoming a big issue in Bolivia. The Chiquitanía fires got a lot of coverage, both in the mainstream media. It got coverage in the national media in Bolivia, then the international press, and all of the agencies, the main agencies being Reuters, AP, AFP, and FA, and then some of the other mainstream papers now that are online. And they were reporting, kind of perpetuating this idea that is used against leftist governments, that leftist governments, such as the movement towards socialism and Evo, are bad on issues like the environment. I mean, this is a completely new idea. Evo Morales has been a leader on environmental issues, and that's actually what he was known for when he took power in the 2000s. And so it's really bizarre that they came around to turn this narrative using these, destabilizing actors with very clear links to the US State Department and to US funding to be able to, churn out this new narrative using the press. And not only that mainstream foreign press, but also alternative media was really key in this and in all of these cases, because in a lot of, what's supposedly leftist media, they ended up publishing, at the very height of the moment when these countries and these peoples of Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Bolivia needed solidarity most, they were publishing op-eds or, things from some of their own editors or editorial board, which was actually, just kind of corresponded with the narrative that was being disseminated by the State Department at that time in favor of a coup. And so we saw right-wing outrage over the environment, sectors that traditionally have never cared about environmental issues, about social issues, really. All of a sudden now, what's in the playbook is that, the US State Department and the CIA is really promoting these issues of identity, these social issues. They're saying that not only is the mass bad on issues of the environment, but also indigenous issues, which is completely, berserk. It's totally bizarre to even say, because the mass literally receives more than half, the vast majority of the vote when it goes to elections, both on a national level for the presidential elections, but also in the municipal and gubernatorial elections, they received, they win most seats. They have majorities in both houses. And this is a party that's made up of grassroots organizations. It's made up of women's indigenous organizations. It's made up of, their support base is many communities, where if you were to look at an electoral map, you would just see huge swaths of blue across the board, where the majority of the country of the map of Bolivia would just be covered in blue, because they have a block vote, because that's how strong of support the MAS has gained or continues to receive in these different regions of the country. And these regions, a lot of them are, the vast majority of them are indigenous, such as the Department of Potosí, Oruro. These are places where the indigenous people live, and they vote MAS. But they were trying to say during this time that, and they're trying to say it once again, that the MAS and Evo was bad on indigenous issues. Absolutely, most people in Bolivia will tell you that's completely wrong, but that was being published in a lot of foreign press. Like in the cases of Venezuela and Nicaragua, we saw violent elements begin to emerge, particularly in October of 2019, after the elections, which Evo won in the first round. So he won the elections, but it took a few days for the results to be clear. And he won with a 10% margin over the closest competitor, which was Carlos Mesa. So Evo was reelected and should have taken office this January for his fourth term. But people, there was a very loud minority and violent minority that was backed by the international right that didn't want Evo to take the presidency once again. And so we started to see, some movement by the Unión Juvenil Sandinista, which is the far-right youth in the department of Santa Cruz, mostly all in the capital, which is the city of Santa Cruz. And they're led by Luis Fernando Camacho, who's a very, key figure during the coup of 2019, and has also led the destabilization attempts now, and is someone that they haven't been able to jail, haven't been able to, press charges against. Also in Cochabamba, we saw the RJC, the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, which is motoqueros, the motorcycle gangs, I guess, or the parastate groups, whatever you want to call them. But they worked hand in hand with the police that mutinied during the coup, during those days following the 2019 election. And they actually, did some of the dirty work for the coup loyal security forces when the coup was actually taking place. This group, the RJC, also attacked indigenous women and, working class indigenous people. And a lot of it was caught on, grainy cell phone video, but it circulated quite widely. And this is, what provoked a larger confrontation across the country. Is because, things became really polarized. But once some of the mass bases, particularly some of the indigenous sectors, like in the Tropico of Cochabamba, which is where I'm based, also known as the Chapari, once they saw this anti-indigenous and anti-indigenous woman racism and bigotry, and just what is, fascism, they came to the city to respond and to try to protect, people, stand up for women and defend these women. And so some clashes took place around late October following the election. This violence continued when Evo Morales was forced to resign on November 10th, which was a Sunday, forced by the actors within the military and the police that were paid and had prepared this coup with the different actors. Of course, Janine Áñez being one of them, who went on to swear herself in as president of the Senate and then president of the country. Obviously unconstitutionally, illegally, without quorum, to say the least. And so she swore herself in, and this set off a whole another string of violent confrontation. And after she took power, just a few days later, so she would have taken power on the 12th, and she committed the first, or oversaw the first massacre of her administration, or large massacre, because there were other killings as well, on November 15th, 2019. So that was exactly 2 years ago, was the Wayani-Sacaba massacre. And 11 men were killed. All of them were indigenous. All of them were from the Tropico of Cochabamba and the Sacaba area. Many of them were quite young. And, you know, this was just an absolutely horrible event that wasn't documented well enough at the moment that it happened. We did go and report on it afterwards because a lot of the foreign press who had arrived were just in La Paz. But she went on to govern over, you know, another massacre 4 days later in Sincata, which is an area of El Alto, one of the main cities of Bolivia, and other atrocities as well, political persecution, incarcerations, etc. But going back to, you know, how we came around to this coup attempt that ended up being successful, we saw, you know, in slow motion, and we didn't react soon enough, but, you know, one of these groups that was pushing this idea that the mass is so horrible on the environment and is ecocidal, and all these different things they say, was a group that exists purely online on social media. It's called Rios de Pie, or in English, Standing Rivers. And it is headed by a person named Janice Vacadaza. And she describes herself in her own bio as being a campaign manager, I believe, of Human Rights Foundation. And, you know, with participation in Human Rights Foundation's Oslo Freedom Forum. And this is, of course, a sort of like coup manufacturing, you know, conveyor belt, sort of an institution. The Human Rights Foundation was founded by a, you know, right-wing fascist Venezuelan, and they bring in people to, you know, partner with them into their annual Oslo Freedom Forum to speak about repression, to speak about you know, human rights violations, and, you know, concoct all sorts of other lies about, you know, the governments of their respective countries, always singling out countries that just happen to be the enemies of the United States, of Washington. So, you know, for example, today, this year, which was about, let's say 2 months ago, or maybe a month ago, the Oslo Freedom Forum was held in Doral in Miami, as well as, you know, partly in Oslo. And they invite people such as dissidents from China, from the DPRK, from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Nicaragua, from Bolivia. And, you know, in the previous year, maybe the year of the coup, they had a lot of participation from right-wing Bolivians. And this is kind of like, you know, a Star Search kind of a, if you remember that show, I don't know if it exists anymore, but it's like a contest or something, or a gathering of a bunch of talent to try to funnel money, find ways to launder money to these different regime change operators on the ground. Because, you know, we're still at a stage where, you know, the empire still needs to pretend to some extent that these are organic movements, organic resistance, organic uprisings, and that they're coming from, you know, these different groups within the country, groups that don't agree with the policies of their government. But what we know is that this is actually, you know, being planted and planned from the exterior. That's extremely clear in the case of Cuba. There is a comrade that lives in Florida who runs a website called Cuba Money Project, where he very clearly documents the amount of money that's coming from the United States. And, you know, it's the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, and being sent to these different groups and individuals within Cuba in order to just fund opposition to their government. So this took place also in Bolivia with through people like Janice Vacadaza. And so, you know, and it's really important to say that these people have absolutely no support base in their country. This group that Janice Vacadaza runs, that's called Rios de Pie, is just not a real organization. I'm not sure if it would have a real headquarters. I've been to 7 of the 9 departments of Bolivia to report, and all of the major cities. And I, have never even, I guarantee that if I were to even raise these people's names who are involved with, receiving money from the United States to do this sort of NGO work in the country, that most people in Bolivia wouldn't even know who they are, because they're not politicians, they're not social leaders, they're not union leaders, they don't head any movements, they're not cultural leaders, they're not student leaders. Most of them wouldn't be students anyways, because most of these regime change actors are too old to be students. A lot of times they use people who are like 36 and they call them students. That's the case in Venezuela in 2019 or 2017. And so, these people just only exist online. And obviously we saw that in the case of Juan Guaido. They created an entire presidency for him that was strictly based online, a foreign ministry, all of the accounts parallel to the existing real institutions of the Venezuelan state were replicated just with a slightly different logo. And that was said to be the legitimate Venezuelan government until everyone gave up on it more recently. So in Bolivia, like in other cases, these destabilization and pro-coup groups, they campaign and they propagandize, focusing on things and claims such as that the MAS and EVO are bad on women's issues, that they're bad on indigenous women, indigenous issues, and highlighting the narratives that are formed around outliers, essentially silencing the vast majority of people who voted for, who continue to vote for and support their popular governments and the most popular parties in their country. And that's what we're seeing in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela as well. But it's very stark in Cuba and Nicaragua. I mean, the amount of opposition to the government on the ground in real life is very small. And I think anyone would be able to see that going to most regions of the country. And I'll send it back to you guys for a second because I'm losing my voice. But I just wanted to say as well that, it's been very key in the case of Bolivia that they used bots and they tried to manipulate algorithms the way in which they're doing in Cuba repeatedly, through, using these sort of like call center type places where they have a bunch of people, working, running hundreds of different false accounts with obviously false pictures that you can just look up in Google and just find out that it's just a stock image, or just, an image of a typical looking Latin American woman or girl, young girl, because, the student image is supposed to be very provoking because they use that story beginning in 2017. I mean, before that, in 2014, but they've been using this image of the student to try to provoke, certain emotions to the international community. And so, this is a tactic that they've been using, but in the case of Bolivia, that was widely exposed. And even when the regime came to power, they were using fake accounts as well as paying journalists to cover the regime, the coup regime of Janine Áñez, in a favorable light.
Thank you, Camila. It's very interesting to learn about the way the coup was working in Bolivia. And thanks for the Bolivian people that realize what is waiting for them and voted again for the MAS and for Evo Morales. We didn't mention much Cuba, but I think that Cuba now is in the news. I didn't catch what happened today in Cuba, whether there were incidents in the streets, violent incidents or not, but certainly what's happening in Cuba is part of the campaign that Camila, you are talking about. There is one thing, Ben, that that doesn't make sense to me. Why would young people who will rebel against their government at the moment when there is economic boom and social boom, where unemployment is the lowest in 20 years, it just doesn't make sense that the conditions in Nicaragua in 2018 would lead to a rebellion. In other words, it looked more like an attempt, and it was very, very destructive operation for 3 months, right? So it looks more like engineered to create damage rather than an organic uprising.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I would never call it an organic uprising. It was absolutely not an organic uprising. Earlier, I think I might have said legitimate protest just to distinguish between the violent elements, because I mean, the right-wing opposition has the right to organize protests. Of course, they're bogus protests. They're in support of neoliberal reforms and corporations, and they don't want to increase taxes on the rich. But when I said legitimate, I didn't mean to say that they were good. I mean that they were not like violent incitement and insurgency. Whereas the point I'm saying, it's the same thing that happened in many countries. I mean, again, we can disagree with and oppose the right-wing protest, but there's a big difference between a right-wing protest and the violent incitement. And the thing is, the nature of these operations is that they intentionally try to blur the line between those two things. So if you criticize the coup attempt, then they say, well, you're authoritarian, you're supporting a supposed violent crackdown on protests. But they're not. It's not the protests, it's the violent incitement through militarized elements. And this is exactly what they did in Libya. It's exactly what they did in Syria. It's what they've done many times in Venezuela. It's what they did in Nicaragua. And it's, of course, what they did in Bolivia. And I remember in October in Bolivia, before the elections, there were already these protests going on that were very violent. There was a mixture of protest with the violent elements. And I mean, actually, ironically, in US foreign policy circles, they would refer to that as a gray zone. That's one of the reasons we call ourselves the gray zone, is like the DC lanyards, like all the people on K Street in the DC think tanks, they refer to the idea of gray conflict or the gray zone as the point in between violent war and normal politics, which is all other means, right? And the point is that the nature of these conflicts is they intentionally try to obfuscate and blur the line between protests and violence. In fact, really quickly, I'm going to show people, because I have it up on my screen. If I can share my screen, can you all see this? Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
So this is an article that I published back in July on the anniversary of the revolution. And there were very few journalists here because of COVID, unfortunately. So I did a report on the anniversary of the revolution. And here you can see photos of, unfortunately, the government did not have their big rally that they normally have every year, where there's hundreds of thousands of people because of COVID, right? So they didn't have the official rally. All of these people you're seeing here in photos are people who came because they love the Sandinistas. They came on their own will because it's the anniversary of the revolution. It's not because it was a government organized rally. Usually the rallies are actually way bigger. I have photos from 2019, and there was over 1/5 of the Nicaraguan population. I mean, there's about 6.5 million people. Over 1/5 was in Managua to celebrate the revolution. So, I mean, the Sandinistas have a massive support base. They're extremely popular. This photo is actually from midnight on July 18th, the night going into midnight on the morning of July 19th. This is one of the main plazas in downtown Managua. There were thousands and thousands of people who brought their cars to celebrate their anniversary of the revolution. Insane traffic. I mean, it was a huge party all night long. And actually, on the night of the election here, which I think we're going to talk about, Camila was here as well. On the night of the election, on the night of November 7th, there were also people out super late, like at around midnight and late into the early hours of the morning, celebrating as well. But anyway, the reason I got up this article, I can share a link to it in the chat. But the reason I got up this article is because in his speech that President Ortega gave on the anniversary, every year he speaks, he referenced what I'm talking about. And in my article, I summarized his main talking points because it confuses people. Someone asked in the chat, why would the government allow the violent coup plotters and rioters to continue? Well, because they understood that they couldn't necessarily defend themselves, because if they defend themselves, then it could potentially make the violence worse. And it's so similar to Palestinian resistance. When Palestinians defend themselves against aggression by the Israeli apartheid regime, then the Palestinian response is portrayed as aggression. And then the corporate media propaganda says Palestinians are attacking Israel, ignoring the Israeli incitement, right? And that's exactly the strategy in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Iran and Hong Kong and all these places where the US is trying to pursue regime change. The US supports these violent elements that intentionally provoke as much violence as they can, and then they use the response of the government to say that the government is the aggressor. So here, really quickly, these are the comments that Ortega made. Ortega praised the national police for, quote, resisting the provocations, the bullet wounds, the deaths, end quote. He specifically highlighted the officers in Masaya. I mentioned they were under siege for weeks. And Ortega said, quote, how difficult it was in that moment to have to tell those comrades there not to shoot back, not to resist, to endure it, not to shoot, while the terrorists were fighting bullets with funding from the Yankees, from the oligarchy, attacking every day, end quote. And he continued, quote, it was a provocation. They wanted the police to react so they could say it was a massacre, end quote. And then he explained, this is him explaining the strategy of the US-backed coup, quote, the police were simply following orders to resist without firing any bullets, which are the most difficult orders to follow when an institution is being attacked, when a command is being attacked. And then I mentioned that his comments here, I'm going to share my screen one more time here. This is an article. How do I stop here? I'm going to stop the share. This is an article that was published in the New York Times. It's an incredibly revealing article, and it's extremely relevant for Nicaragua, for Venezuela, for Bolivia. This is published in 2019. It's a pseudonym used by one of these Hong Kong insurgents, and we've done many articles at the Grayzone showing how, just as in the coup attempt in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, the U.S. funneled millions of dollars, poured millions of dollars into Hong Kong to support these insurgents. And this article here, I mean, it just spells out the strategy. It's called A Hong Kong Protester's Tactic. Get the police to hit you. And they say use aggressive nonviolence, which is a hilarious term. What they mean is that use violence, but not fatal violence, to provoke the state authorities and win over the public. And here, he admits the strategy here, which is what Ortega was referencing in his comments. He's talking about the strategy. This goes back to, I mean, this is the new US coup playbook. Everyone has a phone. There's live streaming 24/7. So everything that happens in these protests, which are really often not protests, they're violent incitement, they're riots, they're insurgencies. So it's all being filmed 24/7. So they don't even necessarily need to do what the Contras did in the 80s. Instead, they just use all of the power of the propaganda and the media. So anyway, here's this article in the New York Times really quickly. There's an important idea that has been circulating in online forums, i.e., that is being spread by US government networks through the NED and USAID. It is called marginal violence theory, and it holds that protesters should not so-called actively use or advocate violence. I mean, in reality, they are using violence. They're lighting people on fire, as we saw in Venezuela and in Hong Kong and in Nicaragua. They lit people on fire. There's videos and photos of this in Hong Kong as well, not just in Venezuela and Nicaragua, but instead use the most aggressive, nonviolent actions possible to push the police and the government to their limits. So this is exactly the strategy. The protesters should escalate, maybe even resort to mild force to push the government to the edge. I don't know about you all, but if you're using force, to me, by definition, that is not nonviolence. He even admits it here, maybe even resort to mild force. What that really means is that they're not going to kill police, but they're going to use violence against the police. And he says that was the goal of many people who surrounded and barricaded police headquarters in June. So these are the same tactics that were used in Nicaragua. It's incite the government as much as you can and get the government to respond, and then use the response of self-defense of the government and portray that as a violent crackdown, when in reality, it's self-defense against a violent coup attempt. And Ortega referenced that in his comments, and that's why the government actually in Nicaragua decided not to have a hands-on approach. And that's why I'm going to share one other article here before I cut back to Camila. That's why this article I shared in the comments is really important. I'm going to get it up. This is by a really good journalist here in Nicaragua, one of the only English language journalists who's pro-Sandinista, named John Perry. This article we published is called "Counting Deaths for Dollars: The Rise and Falls of Nicaragua's Human Rights Organizations." And here he goes through the death toll and the propaganda of all these US government-funded fake human rights groups which were set up in Miami by the Reagan administration during the Contra era, groups like CENID, which is funded by the US government. So there's all these fake human rights groups that had ridiculous death tolls, and included in the death tolls were things like, here we go. Included in the death tolls where they tried to blame it on the government. This researcher, Enrique Hendricks, he went through all the death tolls. They found that there were included in this fake human rights group, CENID, which was funded by the US government, a right-wing group in Nicaragua. They included a suicide, traffic accidents, and duplications or unexplained deaths in their so-called list of deaths during the coup attempt, and they blamed the government for all of those deaths. And of the 167 deaths included in their early reports, just 31% were actually protesters, which is a charitable term. That is opposition extremists who had died in the conflict. And by the way, 31% is obviously less than 1/3. And there were more Sandinista deaths, as this article explains. There were more Sandinistas killed than here we go. So than the actual so-called protesters. Here's another bogus report from the Organization of American States, which is obviously an arm of the coup. They listed 212 deaths, but Hendricks, the researcher, found only 25% were actual protesters. And right here we go. The Truth Commission. So this is right here. This is the Truth Commission was set up to review the deaths during the coup attempt. And they found that the Truth Commission was able to issue a final report on the death toll, and found, after an exhaustive analysis of different sources, confirmed the total number of 253, less than half claimed by these other groups. And here we go. This is the relevant part. The Truth Commission found that of the 253 deaths, 31 were known supporters of the opposition, 48 were Sandinista supporters, 22 were police, and 152 were unknown. So according to the Truth Commission, 31 were known opposition people, 48 were Sandinistas, 22 were police. That is twice as many government or Sandinista, government supporters or Sandinistas as the opposition deaths. So if you actually look at the numbers, what you end up seeing is that more than half of the deaths, of the identified deaths, were government supporters and Sandinistas. It's very similar to in Syria. If you look at this group, which is funded by the British government in Syria, called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which again is funded by the British Foreign Office, which is founded by a Syrian opposition activist who lives in Coventry, England, and hasn't been to Syria in over a decade. And from his house, he ran this operating firm, this observatory, which was used for all of the media coverage. And even according to their reports, they admit that in the war in Syria, slightly over half of the combatant deaths were pro-government forces in Syria. So it's so similar to the propaganda war in Syria and in Nicaragua, where what the US backs this violent coup attempt, which escalated to a civil war in the case of Syria. Ortega was trying to avoid a civil war. And then what they do is there's all this propaganda and all these fake human rights groups that are funded by the US government to spread propaganda, as Camila was saying, as the same thing in Bolivia. And then their partisan bogus reports are cited by the media as supposed unquestionable facts and statistics. But if you actually look, even if you look through at their reports and you have a critical eye, what you end up seeing is that even they admit that more than half of the deaths are pro-government forces.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, Camila.
Yeah, I think going back to Cuba, in the lead up to today's US planned, whatever it is that they were trying to do there, which could just be a false flag in the days to come, They were just making so many different statements. And last week, Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez, held his first in-person press conference with the international accredited diplomats. He spoke about the different aggression by the United States against Cuba, and they had tracked about 29 different US officials who have made public statements in the last couple of weeks, or maybe it was the last month or two leading up, or, since these November 15th so-called protests were announced. And so, different people making all of these interventionist statements, warning the Cuban government, issuing warnings, promoting the protests. It's just really bizarre activity anywhere in the world. But, a lot of that was statements that were being made on Twitter and other social media. But they were saying things like, Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was saying, that the United States calls on the Cuban government to allow these peaceful protesters to demonstrate and express their opinions, and for the Cuban government to not react with violence. I mean, this is exactly what we heard in 2017 in Venezuela, that, like Ben said earlier, we were, the press was all over the place. These big agencies with powerful cameras and a whole team, extremely well funded, and they're just waiting for the setup. And, it's just a whole staged incident of repression where we're in the armed paramilitary young people who, by the way, are paid, who are given drugs and alcohol and other substances to stay awake all night and to kind of engage in this sort of street violence, provoking the security forces, are sent to go, plant themselves in front of the police officers who have also been working long hours. They're supposed to be protecting property. They're supposed to be protecting neighborhoods, and trying to create an incident. And even if an incident doesn't take place, trying to find the right picture and the right angle, which makes it look as if it's this, this big, dark security force figures with their big armored vehicles or tanks, attacking these young students. And of course, we know they're not young students. It's pretty clear that these were people who are just less fortunate, addicted to different illicit substances, live on the streets, need a little bit of extra money. A few dollars makes all the difference, plus free food, plus alcohol. This is why they were participating in these different violent events in both Venezuela and Nicaragua. But, no such thing has actually happened in Cuba. We didn't have the guarimbas in Cuba the way in which we had them in Venezuela. And at no time has the Cuban government used excessive force against Cuban citizens, against anyone, against journalists. It just hasn't happened. And anyone who's ever been to Havana or been to Cuba should know what the situation is like. It's literally a country of law and order. It is a country of rules, of peace and tranquility. But, the state really has control of things. And there really hasn't been a moment when things got out of hand. There was just one day for a period of hours in July where there were protests that we haven't seen. I mean, it really says a lot that, the media had to break out into coverage on this, but they really weren't able to capture any actual instances of repression or any such thing. But yet, at the same time, we have on Twitter all of these fake bot accounts accusing the government of using excessive force and brutalizing people, young people, activists, suggesting that these might be Afro-Cuban people, which is also bizarre. If Black Afro-descendant people are oppressed in Cuba, you should know that they're the majority of people, that the majority of Cubans and all Cubans are oppressed because all are Afro-descendant. This is a Black country, it's an African-descended country. We should not be using identity politics to try to obscure the facts here, making it seem as if Black people are the minority in a country where everybody comes from an African descendancy. It's very important to try to not make it seem as if, the reality, of course, in Cuba is that on a systemic level, these sorts of inequalities have been eliminated. They still exist because this is a country that has the same history of colonization as every other country in our region. And so, of course, these different modalities of work and plantations and slavery, enslavement, and exploitation existed, and also, discrimination and bigotry that is racism based on race, based on class, and based on gender, of course, as well. But that these things have been on a systemic level been eliminated by the Cuban state. And so we're going to continue to see, some of these issues for years to come, but they exist, as a, in kind of, these are dwindling, and we're seeing the ways in which, these countries, specifically Nicaragua and Cuba, are leading in gender equality, and where, Black revolutionaries are in leadership positions. But so online, they're making charges of potential massacres. A massacre is going to occur. We need the international community to have their eyes on Cuba so that the police don't abuse their power. But in what instance has that actually happened before? We have live streams and independent media, leftist media, all sorts of media who have been on the ground in November of 2017 in Honduras. And the days following the election, we had, these fraudulent elections in Honduras where the right took power, even though the left won. The people took to the streets and they demonstrated against that. This is a country who had its democracy pulled from it when the coup took place in 2019 against Zelaya, and the people protested in the streets. And we saw the mass incarcerations, the violence against journalists, the stifling of dissent. The repressive forces were literally chasing down citizens in the streets. And there's also, paramilitaries and other dangers there. But these are things that we actually caught on camera, just the way that since Colombia, in April 30th, when these protests, began against, certain policies, neoliberal policies, then against, different sorts of neoliberal austerity, against, the paramilitarism, and that close partnership with the United States began. We saw that, just day in and day out repression being reported by the social movements, brutality such as kidnapping, tortures. People were being taken to unconventional detention centers, not to jails or precincts, or the ones that you're supposed to take people to. They were just being taken to bridges. People were found, drowned in the water, thrown off top of bridges. People went missing and they were disappeared. I mean, wasn't the era of disappearances supposed to be the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Why is this still taking place and there's no international outrage? So quite literally, we have bots and right-wing Cubans
Looks like we lost Camila.
Froze up.
She's frozen. We'll wait, but in the meantime, Nancy, are you raising your hand? Do you have a question? Nancy Casey? You are muted. You are muted, Nancy.
We're going to have to unmute her. Let's do that now. Let's see. Can you unmute, Nancy?
I can ask her to unmute.
Do it one more time, Nancy. I think you almost got it.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, good.
That's it. That's
You're
it.
on now.
That's a mistake, but I'm really impressed with this workshop. And it is really frightening because actually, now that you give all that history, the same thing is almost happening in the United States. It's beginning. And the United States should pull out of all these countries we're messing up. Thank you. I don't know how to get that off. How do you get chat off? I don't know how to use it. No,
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Ben, I'm going to ask you, I don't see Camila yet. It looks to me that what we have here is a plan that has took many years to develop, because we start with the NICA Act at 2017. Then you have the 2018 riots in Nicaragua. Then they enact the NICA Act. Then the 2018 become the focus of demonizing the Sandinista government, claiming that it is dictatorial, delegitimizing the election, and then you have the Renaissance Act before even the results of the election are public, and now we see an escalation in this campaign. So it looks to me like 2018 is a key fact, but how long it takes to prepare such an action? Because as far as I know, they trained about 8,000 young people through their NGOs and other NED project in Nicaragua. What's your sense about the 2018 is part of a larger plan?
Yeah, I posted a link here to an article that I published that investigates the role of funding, and it shows how these networks were created over years, and it actually goes back to even before the Sandinistas returned to power in the 2006 elections. Really quickly, I'll just share my screen. I'm not going to go through it because it's too long. I'll just briefly. So the piece is called "How USAID Created Nicaragua's Anti-Sandinista Media Apparatus, Now Under Money Laundering Investigation." So it's focusing largely on media outlets, but because the media played such a key role in spreading fake news during the 2018 coup attempt, they would like calling them even media outlets is generous. There's these outlets in Nicaragua like 100% Noticias, La Prensa, Confidencial, Esta Semana, Esta Noche. And they would have these streams, these broadcasts where people would just call on the coup mongers to go to the streets and to kill Ortega. There's videos we published. I published a video in that article of this coup plotter named Oscar René Vargas, who's participating in one of these streams on 100% Noticias, which is a U.S. government-funded right-wing Nicaraguan media outlet. And he openly says, he lays out 5 scenarios for a coup. He calls it a coup. And he lays out 5 scenarios for how they could overthrow the government. And he said, we can have a soft coup, a hard coup, a hot coup. And he said, another option is that we can invite the U.S. military and Southern Command can come and they can do the Panama option, the Noriega option. And then he said, finally, if that doesn't happen, we can make a team. We can have 500 or 600 of us, and we can storm the presidential house in El Carmen, and maybe 100, 200 die, but we can kill Ortega and hang his body in public. He said that, like, and that happened all the time during the coup attempt. Like, the U.S. government played a key role in funding all of this. The point is that in that investigation, I go through and I show the funding from USAID and NED, and it goes back well over a decade to when the Sandinistas came. I mean, when the Sandinistas won the 2006 election, in that year, in that election, I published another article recently looking at U.S. embassy cables released by WikiLeaks, and it shows how much the U.S. was meddling in the 2006 election that the Sandinistas won, and it shows how much the ambassador was pressuring all the opposition parties to unite behind a candidate, was offering hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. so-called aid if the Sandinistas lost, bribing basically the Nicaraguan people, saying that if you vote for the opposition again, if you don't let the Sandinistas come back, we're going to give you all this money and all these resources. And I mean, it's a strategy that has continued on and on for many years, and it's still going on now. Now, Nicaragua did pass a foreign agents law in 2020. The National Assembly, which is democratically elected, passed a foreign agents law, which is similar to the FARA law in the US, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which has been in a law since the 1930s for over 80 years. And when Nicaragua passed it, the Biden administration freaked out and said that now Nicaragua is on the path to dictatorship and all this nonsense. But that law made it much more difficult for these NGOs to get US government and European funding to carry out these coup operations. But I mean, the question is hard to answer because we don't know exactly when they started plotting the 2018 coup attempt, but we do know that it's a constant, that around the world, through NED, USAID, the State Department, through all of these arms, the US is constantly funding opposition, neoliberal right-wing opposition groups pretty much everywhere.
Two questions in the chat before I go to Michael, who raised his hand. Two questions. One really big question from Barbara. Why do you think the US is so hell-bent on interfering in left government and movements, and specifically in Nicaragua? That's a big question. And the other question is, what do you think about what do you think the danger are for a coup in Nicaragua at the present time?
I'll start with the second because it's quick and easy. Very, very small. The chances of our coup are very small because 2018 was their only opportunity and they really blew it. And actually it came back and bit the opposition. It blew back because now the Sandinistas are even more popular. They were popular before the coup, but polls consistently show, I'm just going to show this really briefly. I'm not going to go through it. I'm doing 2 minutes here. These are polls from recently. This poll is from May, and it shows that in May, 68% of Nicaraguans thought that the government of Ortega was taking the country in a good direction. 69% approved of Ortega, 17% disapproved, and 73% had approval in the government. Had hope in the government. Esperanza's hope. And you can see here that, let me get up another. So if you all can see this, this is another article that I published recently. This is one of the more recent polls before the election. These are from August. They found that 70% of Nicaraguans identify with the Sandinista front. 60% said, this was 2 months before the election, that they would vote for the Sandinistas, 15% for the opposition. And you can see different things here. It shows the opposition. But what's important about these polls, I want to get up this graph. What's important about them is you can see here, you can see the graph over time. And you can see in 2006 and 2007, when the Sandinistas came back to power, they had consistently a little over around 40%. Well, this is actually, it's not the best poll to look at because this is for, yeah, I mean, so anyway, whatever. This is when the Sandinistas came back to power in 2007. And you could see that there was around 1/3 of support, 40% support for the government. But you can see as the government implemented universal health care, universal education, housing programs, women's empowerment programs, tons of social spending, their support massively increased. And you can see that here before the coup attempt from 2011 until 2018, they consistently had 60 to 75% of support. And then you can see that with the coup attempt, that support did fall, but it never fell below 50%. And then since the coup failed, it has been increasing. So anyway, the point is that the government support has been increasing since the coup failed, and the opposition support has really plummeted because they saw how violent the opposition was. So at this point, it's very likely there will be a coup. Which is why the U.S. strategy is going to be a blockade. So just as in Venezuela, the violent coup attempt in 2017 failed. So then the U.S. began imposing more and more sanctions, which accelerated into a full-on blockade. And today is November 15th. Today, the U.S. just imposed new sanctions on top Nicaraguan officials and the public ministry. And the British imposed sanctions as well. And I think over the next few years, we're going to see more and more sanctions, and there's going to be an economic blockade of Nicaragua. Because the reality of this is the playbook. That's why that Camila and I were talking about Venezuela and Bolivia and Hong Kong and Syria and Libya and all these other countries, because it's the same playbook. There's variations, but it's the same tactics. If the violent coup attempt fails, if you can't start a civil war, then you just sanction the country to death. You impose more and more sanctions. You pose an economic blockade. And that's what the US has been doing to Cuba since 1960. And now for the other question, briefly, why is the US so hell-bent on overthrowing and meddling in these leftist countries? I mean, it's very clear, because the US is the global protector of capitalism. I mean, all we have to go look back at the first Cold War. It's not a coincidence that the first Cold War, it was not just a Cold War on the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. It was a very hot war in Korea, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, where the CIA backed a coup in 1966 and 1967. And the CIA admitted that the US-backed fascist military junta led by Suharto in Indonesia, they killed between 1 and 3 million communists and leftist sympathizers, liquidating the largest communist party in all of Asia, which was in Indonesia. And the CIA admitted that the CIA-backed genocide in Indonesia was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, up there with the Nazi death camps. So, I mean, the whole point of the Cold War is it wasn't about freedom and democracy on one side and authoritarianism. It had nothing to do with democracy. Some of the founding members of NATO were fascist dictatorships. The Portugal fascist dictatorship in Portugal, which was allied with Nazi Germany, the Portuguese fascist dictatorship was a founding member of NATO in 1949. The Somoza regime, the Somoza dictatorship, the right-wing military dictatorship here in Nicaragua, was a founding member of the Organization of American States in 1948. And of course, the US propped up how many fascist dictatorships in South Vietnam, in South Korea, in Indonesia, in Chile with Pinochet. I mean, the 73 CIA coup in Chile, installing the fascist Pinochet military junta, that was the peak of the Cold War. The Cold War had nothing to do with democracy. It was entirely about destroying socialism anywhere, because the US is the global protector of capitalism, because after World War II, the European colonial powers destroyed themselves in inter-imperialist war. They destroyed themselves with the war against Nazi Germany, and after World War I, they waged war against each other. And the US emerged out of World War II as the only major country that was not significantly devastated by the war. And it became the major superpower and defender of capitalism. And then they created the IMF and the World Bank and the Bretton Woods system, and the dollar became the de facto global currency. And then after Nixon took the dollar off of gold in 1972, then the dollar became the de facto reserve currency in global reserves in global around the world. All of the central banks, they would hold their dollars, they would hold their wealth in dollars and in treasury bonds. So the point is that the US is the global superpower that defends capitalism. So any country that challenges that system is going to be overthrown. And after 1991, with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, that's why the regime change wars continued, because the US wasn't happy with overthrowing just the Soviet Union. It had to destroy Yugoslavia, which NATO did in the 1990s. And then it had to overthrow all of the former Soviet allies that maybe were not like great socialist models. Like, I'm not saying that like Saddam Hussein's Iraq was some great, obviously it was, I mean, Saddam did so many horrible things with US support, by the way, like used chemical weapons against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. But they wanted to destroy the Iraqi government that had massive state control over the economy and privatize everything. I mean, the Bush administration boasted about it. After they went into Iraq, they sent in all of the American Enterprise Institute interns. They were literally AEI interns who went into the green zone and implemented neoliberal shock therapy like the US did in Chile. So, and they did the same thing in Libya after overthrowing the Libyan government. And they did the same thing in Bolivia. And Camila can talk about this. In 1 year of the coup regime in Bolivia in power, from November 2019 to November 2020, the coup regime privatized so much, they sold off state assets. I mean, because that's what the Washington Consensus is. Wall Street is based in the US. The heart of global financial capitalism is the US. So the US is desperate to destroy any country that challenges its neoliberal chokehold across the global financial system.
Thank you, Ben. Camila, do you want to add something on this question? Is why the U.S. is trying to destroy the Sandinista revolution, and the Sandinista actually for more than four decades. I mean, we can even go to the 60s when the Sandinista was created. What is it that is pushing the U.S. to trying to destroy a country, a revolution like a Nicaraguan revolution? You are muted, Camila.
There we go.
There you
Okay,
go.
good.
Oh, you muted again. Try again.
Okay.
There we go.
All right.
Well, yeah, a lot of people have said that when we were there, they were saying that the United States doesn't want another example for the rest of the world, an example of progress, of advancing, of economic prosperity, of food sovereignty, an example of the type of rights women and children can have. Women during pregnancy, post-pregnancy, they don't want the model of being able to have socialistic policies while building roads and infrastructure and first-class hospitals. They don't want the model of Indigenous and Afro-descendant people living in their own territories and not being displaced and be able to, govern in autonomous regions. All of these different things are a bad example for the neighborhood and the rest of the world, particularly for, countries like Panama and Honduras and Guatemala, where these countries have movements and communities that are against, land dispossession. They're fighting for their right to a piece of land to be able to grow their own food and live sustainable lives. And they're fighting against multinational corporations that are largely based in Canada and, of course, the United States and other first world countries. And there's a lot at stake. So these social movements are fighting back in these countries. That's being silenced. And then an actual country where the state and the government party in power is working with the different sectors to try to find consensus and find a way to live harmoniously, albeit with disagreements, is something that the world can't see. But apart from that, I think that anyone with a knowledge of the history of our region knows that the reason why there were some gains and revolutions in the case of everything, post the Cuban Revolution is because of that important solidarity that existed between these different countries. And that solidarity wasn't in word only. It wasn't just, here's a hashtag because we're talking about last century, but in fact, it was logistical support, which continues today. It's, being able to, at the time it was support such as, quite frankly, guerrilla training on how to be leaders, political formation, ideological training, getting different experiences with different mass movements in different countries. This was very key, particularly the kind of logistical support provided for different countries and different movements from Cuba and Nicaragua specifically. But in addition to that, now we have these blockades and these unilateral coercive measures, sanctions against countries like Venezuela. And what countries like Venezuela, where I am now, what they have to do in order to be able to circumvent and overcome these sanctions is to continue working with their trade partners, some new, some old, and be able to exercise their right to make purchases, to be able to trade freely, as any country should be able to. And so they're continuing to cooperate. Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela continue to cooperate in medical fields. They in the case of Cuba with the development of their vaccines, they partnered with Iran, Nicaragua, and Venezuela in order to do those testing phases. And there's other areas of cooperation as well, such as having to do with fuel, other, supplies and food. And so they're really just, holding each other together, and they're an anchor for the rest of the countries. And so we have these giants, which are, the ones we've spoken about. This is why we forgot about Bolivia, because Bolivia is in like another category. But these giants that the empire is taking aim of, because they think if they can dismantle one of the three, especially the ones that are immovable, that they'll be able to, just wipe out, socialism and this regional integration that we're building through, SELAC, ALBA, and everything else. And then we have, Bolivia, which also has its own revolution, its own anti-imperialist struggle, and resistance to imperialism in the Americas, and which protects the rights of indigenous peoples and the environment. And then another category is these smaller states, like small Caribbean island states, which also have under long-running governments as well. In some cases, Ralph Gonsalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Roosevelt Scarrett have all been in in 3 or 4 terms as prime ministers. But under those terms and under their governance, they've been able to push for social reforms that have resulted in a better quality of education and more access and healthcare, and so on and so forth. And the reason they're able to do that is with the help and cooperation of camaraderie states such as Nicaragua, Venezuela, and through ALBA now. And so there's a lot of potential to further integrate our region as we see some, more leftist governments be elected. Some difficult things may happen there. They may face a lot of opposition. In the case of Peru, for example, but this all rests on these steadfast revolutions and these socialist governments that we have. So they really just are trying to knock out one of the three, see which one they can get down, but it has proven to be a complete failure.
Yes. Michael, I see your hand is up. Do you have a question? Michael? No, he doesn't respond.
He's coming.
Oh, okay, I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. It wouldn't let me unmute for a minute.
Okay.
Yes, my question, I'm curious about the evolution of our regime change industry. It seems like back in the 60s, they were using
Michael, we lost you. I think Michael
he's logged
disappeared.
off. He's logged off.
Yeah, he is out. Okay, let's continue. Ben and Camila, I don't know if you see the question in the chat. There is a question that we hear a lot about the opposition leaders that were arrested. And I know, Ben, you just wrote an article about some of these opposition members that were arrested, but I think it's something that should be addressed because it is repeated again and again and again. So the question is, why put Dora Maria Tellez in jail? And of course, why Ramirez is out of Nicaragua, and a few other of these characters are in prison?
Because they were key figures in the coup attempt. And we have so much evidence of this. I'm not going to go through this entire thing because it's too long. It's a really long piece. But all of the documents are here showing Dora Maria Tellez has been a U.S. embassy informant since at least 2006, if not earlier. But we have U.S. embassy cables released by WikiLeaks showing how Dora Maria Tellez was collaborating with the U.S. embassy. Dora Maria Tellez was, again, I mean, not that I'm like old and wise or something, but she was 22 years old when she was in the Sandinista front. When the revolution succeeded, she was 23. So she was a member of the Sandinistas for a few years. And then ever since 1994, she's been in the opposition. She spent the majority of her life being in the opposition against the Sandinistas. And since at least 2006 has been a U.S. embassy informant. Just because someone was a former revolutionary doesn't mean that they're still a leftist. I mean, as I explained in this piece, Dora Maria Tejes is a co-founder of a party called the MRS, the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo. They used to call themselves that, although in 2020, they renamed themselves UNAMOS, the National Democratic Union, and they removed all reference to Sandinismo from their platform. And she admitted that her party, in fact, I have it in here. I have the quote in here. Right here. This is a quote that Dora Maria Tejes said earlier this year. She's talking about her party. She says, quote, "We have people who come from liberalism, from Sandinismo, from conservatism, people who have not been in any political party." Dora Maria Tejes and the others haven't been leftists for many decades. In fact, I go through here and I explain the splits that happened within the Sandinista front in the 1990s. It's a very long piece, but the point is that in 1994, there was a split, and then 1995, there was another split, of a right-wing split of all of the elites out of the Sandinista front. And here you can see the people who were the elites. Most of them were from very rich families, wealthy backgrounds that had jobs in the US. When the Sandinistas lost power in 1990, these elites didn't want to organize in working class barrios. They joined the Sandinista revolution because everyone was against the Somoza regime by 1979, even including parts of the right-wing oligarchy were against it, including Violeta Barrio de Chamorro. She was against the Somoza regime as well. So there were elite members of the Sandinistas who in the 1980s, they played roles as government ministers and all of these things. But then in 1990, when the Sandinistas lost power, they didn't want to spend their time organizing poor people in barrios. They consider themselves too elite, they're very elitist. Many of them moved to the US and got jobs at US universities and NGOs. And here you can see a list of all of the major figures who split in 1995 out of the Sandinista front. And in the 1990s, there was a massive debate going on in the Sandinista front. And there were four main issues. The people who became the MRS party, which was co-founded by Dora Maria Tejes, along with Sergio Ramirez, along with others. There were four things. The faction led by Tejes and Ramirez wanted to drop all references to socialism, and they wanted to become a center-left European-style social democratic party. They wanted to renounce any use of violence against or expropriation of land, and they didn't want the peasants to be able to defend their lands. They wanted to drop all references to anti-imperialism, and they admitted in their platform that they said that they wanted good relations with the US based on mutual respect. And they wanted to drop the definition of the Sandinista front as a vanguard party. So Dora Maria Tejes was part of the right-wing split in the Sandinista front in 1995, that she was one of the main leaders that wanted the Sandinistas to become a center-left Democratic Party style party, which would become neoliberal. And here I go through all of the documents from WikiLeaks showing explicitly how all of these leaders have been US embassy informants. In fact, Sergio Ramirez has been a US embassy informant since 1978. So these people, they were conspiring with the US government and they were deeply involved in the coup attempt. The MRS party was one of the main forces behind the coup attempt of Dora Maria Tejes. She was a main figure. And by the way, here's a photo showing Dora Maria Tejes' lifetime partner right here. This is her. They're not officially married, but they're lifetime romantic partners. And her name is Ana Margarita Vigil. And you can see her right here, Ana Margarita Vigil. She is meeting in DC. She's meeting with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the most viciously right-wing neoconservative elements in the Cuba lobby. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, until recently, was a representative from Miami, and she was recently replaced by Maria Elvira Salazar, who's like the most insane fascist Trump-loving coup plotter. And so the point is that this is Dora Maria Tejes' partner that she lived with. And after Dora Maria Tejes was president of the MRS party, Ana Margarita Vigil also became president of the MRS party. So the idea that they're like left-wing opposition to the Sandinistas is insane. They've been in the right-wing opposition since 1995. And why are they detained? Because they violated the laws on conspiring with the US government, taking money to organize a violent coup attempt. And that's true for all of the people who were detained. If you in the US took millions of dollars from a foreign government, from Russia or China or whatever, to try to organize a violent coup attempt in the US and it failed, you would be thrown in prison. But when Nicaragua does it, it's portrayed as political repression. The fact that these people were involved in the coup is not even up for debate. I mean, it's on the piece if you don't believe me, but they were active figures, and we have so many documents, largely from WikiLeaks, but also from the websites of the NED and USAID, proving that they've gotten millions of dollars from the US government. That's illegal in pretty much every country on earth. I don't know of any country on earth where it's not illegal to take millions of dollars from a foreign government to organize a coup.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Ben. I see that Michael returned. Michael, do you want to continue with your question? And your question will be the last question. Michael, do you hear me?
Yes, can you
Great.
hear me? So the question has to do with the evolution of the regime change industry. It seems like in the 60s, it was the Jakarta method. In the 80s, the NED came in. But now there's something new, apparently, according to William Arkin in the Newsweek article in May about a clandestine army, up to 60,000 people, assuming false identities, half of them to go online, the other half just to revolve in and out of countries. So I'm wondering, could you kind of talk about the evolution of the regime change industry and how they're always adapting?
Yeah, Camila, do you want to take a stab at that? Because I just spoke.
Yeah, it's like we were saying about, what we saw take place and was documented in Cuba in July. They used just a lot of bots that were putting out information through Twitter. It was mostly tweets, but it also happened on Facebook as well, using the same hashtags, the same lines, the same words. And they were tweeting at a rate of multiple times per second, which is like not possible, even if it was like one person sitting at a computer sending them all. I don't know how Twitter doesn't filter this out. Of course, at the same time, as Ben probably mentioned, we saw vast censorship. So it's like, this is part of the strategy is to just wipe us all off the internet, us being, revolutionary movements, parties, governments and their institutions, and, alternative media, while also, planting all of these different different messages to try to obscure the idea of what's going on, obscure reality. And so it's extremely dangerous because, like people in the example of Cuba, part of the blockade is that Cubans or the US citizens can't easily go to Cuba. And there's just that interchange, that exchange doesn't exist in the way in which it should, considering they're two neighboring countries and the history these two countries have. And so people don't understand necessarily the reality of Cuba, certainly not firsthand. And so they're able to implant these ideas in our head. And, they are, this is happening in every country where if you go there and spend time, the reality is quite different from what we hear on the outside. And so this happened in the case of Bolivia. It did happen as well in Nicaragua. It's where you just tweet one thing in support or in solidarity with the people of that country, or one truth, and you just get hit by dozens of bots and of people who are trying to exchange the narrative for another. This is like the most important tactic they have, because they know that people spend the whole of their time online, and so they're going to be not only has it moved online, this sort of part of the warfare and the propaganda war, but now it has to further convert itself into formats that are suitable for younger generations and the platforms that people actually use. So we'll see more of it on Instagram and TikTok now.
Yes. Well, I want to thank Camila and Ben for being with us. I want to thank all of you that stay for 2 hours to have this conversation, very important conversation. I think that we are already witnessing the squeezing, the increase in the squeezing of Nicaragua with the Renaissance Act, which is really vicious, because if I understand it correctly, the targets are Sandinistas and their families, which mean that we are talking about 40% almost of the population, 50% of the population, which is incredible. So I think that we need to increase our activism to oppose the NSR and stand in the way of increasing the pressure on Nicaragua. So thank you again, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for the invite, guys.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.